What's up, guys? Y'all know that I have been working for 2 or 3 months now on my transition to bodybuilding, and I want to share some of the training things that I've kind of worked out, discovered, etc. along the way. Now, you guys can probably imagine strength training is my passion, so I'm trying my best to apply the strength training strategies that I know are successful to my hypertrophy style training. And in doing that, I've had the help of a lot of really smart guys. My coach, John Meadows, my training coach, Mike Teixeira. I've gotten input from Justin Harris, from Broderick Chavez, from a lot of other guys who really have been around the block, who know their stuff, and who all think it's a really interesting idea. And I've been using myself very successfully. So I want to share some of these concepts with you in hopes that you can incorporate them into your own training if it's the appropriate time. I do want to mention, this is kind of a training philosophy. It's not a program as such, and I think that's an important mindset to kind of go in with. Remember, the bottom line is you got to find what works for you. So if these particular philosophies don't work for you, that's fine. Don't incorporate them. Just be smart, think strong about your training and about how you're structuring things so you can do so appropriately. Okay. So, if you're familiar with John Meadows' style of training, you know that he breaks it down into 4 phases, and this is outlined in his ebook, which is called The Brutality of Mountain Dog Training. So, 4 phases are basically warm-up and activation, right, where you kind of get the muscle you'll be training that day, you get it kind of loose and prepared, you build that mind-muscle connection that I've been talking about recently on this channel. The second phase he calls explosive training. It's generally a typical strength movement. Maybe you're using bands or chains, some other form of accommodating resistance, straight weights, specialty bars, whatever, but your goal is to train explosively and build that contractile tissue, right, that we usually associate with strength athletes. From there, he goes on to the pump phase, right, where you're just flushing the muscle with blood, and finally finishes with a loaded stretch, which is something that, many high-level bodybuilding coaches, Dante Trudell, Matt Jansen, these guys all think pretty strongly of, Yoda, Neil Hill. These guys all agree that stretching is a benefit, and so, clearly when that many smart people agree, there's something going on there. So I've taken these phases, and I've kind of applied them in my own way to hypertrophy training. And I'll talk about how I'm going to do that. I've incorporated RPE methods, other kind of cool things that I think are really useful. But first, I want to address the 3 goals of training for me at this moment, right? The biggest one, obviously, is to build size, right? Build size and build symmetry, because that's what I really need to be successful as a bodybuilder. However, I also want to avoid injury because, first of all, that's something that's plagued me recently in powerlifting, and because no matter what your goal is when you're training, injury is going to be the thing that holds you back the most. So the more you can do to avoid that in both the short and long term, the better. And then the third goal of training is to maintain my strength as much as possible. Now, I think the 80-20 rule probably applies here, right? You can do 20% of the work, right, in terms of the strength work, and maintain 80% of your performance levels. But for me, I'd really like to try and keep that on the 90% range. That's my goal. I'm not tied to that. I know that as I start dieting harder and harder, it's going to be harder and harder to maintain my strength. And I accept that. I understand that, and I'll need to alter my training accordingly when the time comes. But for the off season, I think maintaining, even building that strength is definitely a reasonable possibility, and you'll see how I do that in these stages that follow. So the very first stage, warm-up and activation, right? Here, John is typically going to have some type of very light movement that he's using for very high reps that's just going to put your body in a position where you can activate or feel the muscle working as best as possible. If you go back to my upper chest video, you can see some ideas of that. I'll also link to a few of John's videos in the description below. However, I think when you're coming at it from a strength athlete perspective, you need a little bit more in that, okay? The very first thing you need is a general cardiovascular warm-up, and that goes for any athlete, all right? You got to spend at least 3 to 5 minutes just moving, right? It can be walking around, it can be some light stationary cycling. Honestly, if you want to do foam rolling as your light movement, that's okay, but you don't want to just jump in from sitting in your car to lifting heavy-ass weights. That's not safe. So do a few minutes of cardiovascular activity. Your goal here is to raise your core body temperature Obviously, you're not going to bring a thermometer to the gym, so just try to break a light sweat. If you break a light sweat, you're probably doing pretty okay. From there, we're going to move into kind of preparatory movements. And for me, these are things that are going to help strengthen my injured areas, more or less. So, for example, my shoulder always bugs me. So I'll be doing a lot of external rotation, band pulls, stability exercises, all that sort of stuff in this phase. If you're looking for other ideas, there's lots and lots of great resources out there. I've been using Strength Coach Therapy on Instagram. He has some great, very simple, easy to follow movement patterns. Obviously, Mobility WOD, the Kabuki Movement Library. These are all great resources that you guys can use to find suggestions for this phase of training. And then finally, you do still want to strengthen that mind-muscle connection, even if you're training for powerlifting, right? It's just the difference will be you'll be focusing on the areas that, rather than specifically the area you're training that day, I think it's more important to focus on the areas that you have trouble recruiting in your compound movement for the day, okay? So let me give you a quick example that can help identify this difference. Let's say you're a bodybuilder, you're training chest, and your first heavy movement is a bench. Well, you're going to make sure your activation movement is a chest-oriented movement. But if you're a powerlifter and your problem on the bench press is really incorporating your triceps, getting that tricep to lock out, or maybe even get your elbows to flare to recruit the triceps at the right time, well, then your activation movement should be a tricep movement. This is not something that's going to wear you out. It's not even going to get a pump, right? It's just to help build that mind-muscle connection. So that's phase one. This should be a very light phase. It's not physically demanding, right? You're preparing your body and your mind for heavier training. The second phase is the strengthening phase, and here's where it does get tough. This is basically going to be your meat and potatoes of powerlifting training, regardless of whether you're training for strength or hypertrophy. They're really two sides of the same coin. So, typically this is going to be a squat, bench press, deadlift, or some variation therein, in which I include overhead presses, rack pulls, front squats, all those sorts of things. And the way you train this section is really up to you. This is one of the beautiful things about this method, I think, is that it leaves you a lot of discretion with your split, with your exact training rep set protocols, with all that stuff that people, can get pretty particular about. And if you don't enjoy what your coach is telling you to do or what the program's telling you to do, it can be tough to stick with it. So having that flexibility, I think, is important. Things you could incorporate here, something like RPE-based training. You can incorporate, you can use a max effort / dynamic effort style, similar to what Westside does. You can use a straight linear periodization percentage-based template. There's no one right answer. Really, whatever you found in the past works best for you is what I strongly suggest you at least begin with in this phase. Now, there's more to it than just strengthening. I think when you're coming at it from a standpoint that your goal is hypertrophy, there also needs to be that level of effort in there while still preventing injury. So let me talk about what I mean by that. When you're training for powerlifting, effort is kind of secondary. The volume and intensity and frequency are your main variables. But for bodybuilding, for hypertrophy, a lot of research, both anecdotal and formal, has shown that you really need to be pushing yourself at the very least, within one rep of failure, maybe 1 or 2 reps of failure, not leaving a lot in the tank if you want to progress. The problem is when you're doing that on a strength exercise, then you run the risk of getting injured, right? If you're pushing yourself all out on a set of heavy squats, you're running the risk of injury. So, to find a happy medium there, I like to incorporate other types of intensifying techniques. So, for example, drop sets, incorporating pauses, using accommodating resistance, all these tools that John really uses in his training as well. But the key here, though, is I really think this phase of your training needs to be progressive, all right? We've talked in the past about how when you're training strictly for hypertrophy, progression isn't as important as it is when you're training strictly for strength. When you're somewhere in the middle, you got to find a happy balance. And so that's how I do it, is I make this my progressive phase of training. And in the full article that I'll post on Elite FTS, I'll give you guys some more examples of how I do that. But, the things that I mentioned are some really good ways that you can push yourself really hard and still minimize the risk of injury, right? Let's say you're doing a drop set, you do 4 or 5 for 5 on the squat, and then you drop down to 225 and rep out. you're probably not going to hurt yourself with 225, even if you are fatigued, right? It's far less than, it's about 50% of 1 rep max. So that's one strategy there. Now, I know we've only made it through 2 of the 4 phases. I actually want to stop here for now. And the reason I'm doing that is because before I continue, before I get into the other phases, which are a little bit less conventional, so far really all we've talked about is warming up and then doing your powerlifting style training. The next 2 phases get a little bit more complicated. I throw in a little bit more twists. And before I get there, I just want to ask you all for feedback to make sure that A, this is a useful subject, which I imagine it is, but B, that I'm being clear enough, that I'm giving you guys enough examples. Because again, so far, you should be with me more or less. But when things start to get more complicated, if I'm being too vague, I need to know so that I can be a little bit more structured in my approach. So let me know about those things, assuming that we're all on the same page, or maybe I need to make a few tweaks. Then, later this week, I'll have part 2 where we deal with addressing your weaknesses and then recovering. How I go about doing that, how I incorporate them into a hypertrophy framework, and some suggestions about how you can set up this style of training for yourself, whether it involves splits, whether it involves, long-term macro cycles, any sort of thing like that, how you can fit it into the structure of your strength-oriented training, or vice versa. If you're strictly training for aesthetics but want to know how you can get stronger as well and in furtherance of that goal, we'll talk about all that good stuff. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope the little teaser was helpful. And until next time, make sure you guys think strong and train hard.